very much to Chatham House, and thank you, Robin, for that wonderful introduction. I will say, when Robin said twice that I'd been at Stanford since 1981, I'm hoping you're all thinking, my goodness, Stanford hired a faculty member at the age of 11. That's really quite something. I'd like to thank Ann Asher for really being the inspiration behind this lecture, and of course it is indeed a great honor to give this lecture in John Whitehead's name. He was the epitome of a public servant, someone who put self well aside so that he could serve the country on numerous occasions. He was a personal friend and a mentor to me, and I'm honored to do the lecture in his name. I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about what I'll call the international disorder, and then Robin and I will have a bit of a conversation, and given that he's one of the very best conveners that I know, I'll keep my remarks to a minimum so that we can have a chance for real interaction. And when I go around the country or the world, I think everyone feels the sense of, I'll call it international disorder, that in fact the international system is not just chaotic at this point, but it's actually dangerous, that there are multiple crises that we seem to be dealing with. And I would like to suggest that these are not actually discrete crises. This is really the breakdown of the international order as we have known it, essentially since the end of World War II. It was an order that was based on two very important principles and one very important fact. Those principles were that free markets would allow a free trading system in which the international economy could grow. Those who constructed that system after World War II were haunted by the way that World War II had come out of really a sense of competition for resources, Japan, Germany, France, and also by a Great Depression that had been driven in large part by beggar thy neighbor policies, by a sense of a fixed economic pie that everybody had to divide more finely. And they wanted to create a different vision for the international economy, that it would be one in which a growing international economic pie, if everyone were willing to have open economies and trade in freedom, would make everyone more prosperous. And they created great institutions to make that true, like the IMF, initially just to try to get the monetary system working again, but also the World Bank, which would reconstruct countries that were devastated by war and later become a focus for those developing countries emerging out of colonialism. They created the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, not so much just a sense of trade agreements, but really a set of rules for an international economy that would trade in freedom. They also believed that free peoples would be more peaceful than those who had been oppressed in authoritarian regimes. They were haunted by the specter of Imperial Japan, by the specter of Nazi Germany. But instead of just saying, all right, we'll just divide these countries up and keep them weak, they really sought to create a democratic basis for governance in Japan with a peace constitution that looks, I have to admit, remarkably like the American Constitution in terms of its political structures, but also having faith that that part of Germany, which was free under Western occupation, would create democratic institutions, and that Germany and France would never fight again. If you'd said in 1946, Germany and France will never fight again, people would have thought you a little bit mad. But indeed, these two great democracies did exist side by side, and this was all to be protected by a fact. And that was this time the United States would not leave in terms of its commitments militarily to defend this system of free markets and free peoples. We had left the last time after World War I, only to be drawn back onto the continent a couple of decades later. And this time, we would commit to the defense of Japan, but we would commit also in a remarkable phrase, Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, an attack upon one is an attack upon all. And when you consider that this was at the time that Joseph Stalin's forces were astride much of Europe, it was quite a commitment to make that the United States would come to the defense of its allies, if necessary. George Robertson reminded me recently, just a little bit ago, of course, the only time that Article 5 was actually invoked was on September 12th, 2001, when NATO voted Article 5, an attack upon one is an attack upon all. That system, free markets, free peoples, protected by permanent American willingness to defend the continent and beyond, succeeded brilliantly, was wildly successful. Millions of people were lifted out of poverty, millions of people into freedom. But it's been buffeted in recent years by major crises and major shocks. Now, we thought that after the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, our work was kind of done. After all, we had defeated the great Soviet rival, and the Soviet Union seemed, as Russia, ready to enter this world of free markets and free peoples. Friends of mine, including the great book by Frank Fukuyama, wrote about the end of history. People talked about peace dividends. And then on that terrible day, on September 11th, we would learn that, in fact, history was back. And it was exacting a different kind of revenge. And the first shock would be that it was perhaps not powerful states that were the real challenge to us, but these ungoverned spaces. After all, Al-Qaeda had come from Afghanistan, the fifth poorest country in the world, to wreak havoc on the United States of America that had not been so since, I'm sad to say, the British burned the White House in the War of 1812. And 9/11 would create a different kind of problem for homeland defense and for democracies trying to balance civil liberties and security, trying to understand how you could exist as a free society if there were untrustworthy among us. It was a challenge not just to our security, but to our values. And then we would have a second big shock, of course, and the great financial crisis of 2008 would create governance crises across the world. And we're still dealing with those governance crises because now we see a world in which populations seem no longer to trust their governments to deliver for them. We always talk about the problems of young democracies not being trusted by their populations, but we're talking about mature democracies. Not just a younger democracy like Brazil, which is having a crisis in its presidency, or a young democracy, the young democracies that we see, but also in Europe, and in the United States, in Japan. Populations that are not sure any longer that democratic governance can deliver what our founding fathers called the ability for the pursuit of happiness. The Middle East, of course, a huge crisis. As the state system unravels that has been in place since the end of the Ottoman Empire, because under the pressures of populations that are saying enough to dynastic, authoritarian regimes that don't deliver, and saying so in a time when what happens in the village doesn't stay in the village. So a shopkeeper who self-immolates in Tunisia brings down the Mubarak government in Egypt. Under the Klieg lights of social media and rapid communication, these weak boundaries between states that were held together essentially by monarchs and by dictators are under extreme pressure. And we have, of course, the resurgence of great power rivalry. China, a rising power, more assertive in international affairs than it has ever been, building sandcastles in the South China Sea, daring people to come near them, which apparently the United States has just done. And the problem with that kind of assertion is not that anybody wants war. It's that mistakes happen. I was the national security advisor on the day that the Chinese downed our aircraft on Hainan Island. It wasn't intentional. It was a Chinese pilot hot-dogging in international airspace. Hit our plane, kept our crew for more than a week. Dangerous crises happen when big powers start to throw their military weight around. And of course, there's Russia, asserting under Vladimir Putin that Russia will be great again, that it will avenge, as he called it, the greatest tragedy of the 20th century when the Soviet Union collapsed, that Russia will no longer be humiliated by a West that really doesn't want it to be a part. Our hopes had been, of course, for a Russia that wanted to be a part of that vision of free markets and free peoples, but perhaps impatient with the results of having joined that system, is turning back to a different Russia, which is always somehow dependent on its sense of empire for identity and its sense of military prowess for influence. Now, this set of problems, these challenges to the international system that we helped to create together, because that system really was a creation of the transatlantic relationship, needs the Transatlantic Alliance more than ever. I know there are talks about pivots to Asia, but ask any American if they really think that our partner in the issues, whether it's the global challenges of poverty reduction or cybersecurity or terrorism or climate change, will our partners really be the Chinese? Will our partners be Russia? Who will be our partners? And when Americans say we want others to be a part of this to help share the burden, they really mean Europe. And from my point of view, it's a Europe, most especially a Europe, with a transatlantic link through Britain. The agenda for that transatlantic alliance is, of course, different today than it was in 1945 or 1946. Then it was to keep at bay a Soviet Union that seemed intent on creating an alternative reality, one of state ownership of the means of production, one of the suppression of peoples within Russia's shores and without it. Today, that agenda is different, but nonetheless equally important. And I just want to suggest a few points on that agenda. First, we in the Transatlantic Alliance have got to repair a growing divide between those of us who were fortunate enough to be on the right side of history in 1946 and those who didn't get there until 1991. There is great tension between the newer states of NATO and the European Union, the Poles, the Baltic states, and others, because they're not so sure that the NATO and European Union membership means the same if you are from that younger generation of members. They feel, for instance, that people are not paying attention to what they think is really going on in Moscow. And so reassuring the East Europeans so that we are all together on the same page again is critical. And a lot of that can be done by work in NATO. I was heartened this morning to see a headline that says that NATO is considering more permanent stationing of forces in the Baltic states and Poland on states on Russia's borders. I think that would go a long way to reassuring the East Europeans and the Central Europeans that Article 5 also applies to them. I believe that we can do great work again around the issue of free trade and free markets. I'm a great supporter of the Trans-Pacific Partnership that President Obama has just concluded. But I hope we will move quickly to a European free trade agreement, which is also on the table. We need growth. Europe needs growth. And trade promotes growth. We have a chance to create an entirely different picture for energy. When I was Secretary of State, oil went to $147 a barrel. Nothing warps diplomacy like $147 a barrel in oil. It allowed Vladimir Putin to play all kinds of games with Ukraine and Europe about Russian energy supply, on which, by the way, Europe is still far too dependent. It allowed Hugo Chavez to buy elections throughout Latin America. It allowed Iran to resist dealing with its nuclear program, which it finally came to the table. We can talk about the agreement, but I can assure you that low oil prices played its part. To restructure our energy supply around a North American platform, the ability to relate to use sources of energy that are not tied to these terrible places would be a great geostrategic victory. And for our part, I hope the United States is actually going to finally get rid of an age-old and really quite archaic notion that we cannot export energy supply. Cybersecurity and the ability to deal with this tension that privacy and security has created among us. I am very saddened by what Edward Snowden has done in making us so distrustful of each other when it comes to issues of big data and the transfer of this information for law enforcement or intelligence purposes. And wherever you stand on that issue, let me assure you that the United States and Europe stand closer on the continuum about issues of privacy and data than do the Chinese or the Russians. And so we need to repair the issues of trust around that issue. And then finally, we have to agree to play a long game. International politics is rarely about quick and easy victory. I was the White House Soviet specialist at the end of the Cold War, and frankly, it doesn't get better than being the White House specialist at the end of the Cold War. I got to participate in the liberation of Eastern Europe and the unification of Germany and the beginnings of the collapse of the Soviet Union. I was harvesting, and all of us, harvesting good decisions that had been taken decades before. In 1946, when the Italian communist won 48% of the vote and the French communist 46% of the vote, the issue wasn't would Eastern Europe be communist. People worried about Western Europe. In 1947, there would be a civil war in Greece and civil conflict in Turkey. And in 1947, 2 million Europeans were still starving, necessitating the Marshall Plan. In 1948, Czechoslovakia would fall to a communist coup. The Soviet Union and the United States would have a major crisis over Berlin. We thought Germany had been split forever. Harry Truman would recognize Israel. War would break out in the Middle East the next day. And in 1949, the Soviet Union would explode a nuclear weapon 5 years ahead of schedule, and the Chinese communists would win. In 1950, the Korean War would break out. Do we really have it so bad now? And if I had said, here's what's going to happen. In 1989, the Berlin Wall will come down. Not a shot will be fired. In 1990, Germany will unify, completely and totally on Western terms. East Germany will go away. And a Germany will emerge that is strong, democratic, at the center of the European Union and united in NATO. On December 25th, 1991, the hammer and sickle will come down from above the Kremlin for the last time, 75 years of communism, never mind. And oh, by the way, in 2006, an American president will go to a NATO summit in Latvia. But I said that in 48 or 58 or 68 or 78 or 88. People would have thought me mad. And so it takes time. And in that regard, patience with the people of the Middle East as they try to sort out issues that we sorted out centuries ago about the relationship of religion and politics. As they try to sort out issues that we sorted out years ago, that institutions should be there where people can actually believe that their interest can be protected by these artificial things called institutions rather than by family or clan or religion or going into the streets for violence. Democracy's not so easy. All of us know that. Britain, centuries ago. But the United States, maybe not so long ago. After all, in 1952, my father still couldn't vote reliably in the state of Alabama. Democracy takes time. And I would extend that patience to the people of Russia. It is my great hope that we can deal with an assertive Russia, a troublemaking Russia that seems perfectly happy to partition states, keeping their adversaries weak, even if their people can only rule part of a country. That's okay. Make Eastern Ukraine weak. Make Moldova a split country. Make Georgia a frozen conflict. And oh, by the way, perhaps in Syria, just control a third of it with your people. And whatever happens in the rest, just fine. But that isn't the Russia of the future. That 20 years mattered between the end of the Soviet Union and now. There's a different population of Russians, many of whom you've studied with, you've worked with, many of whom have never been outside of Russia, but they spoil their children at Toys R Us and they buy their furniture at IKEA. And this isn't the Russia that they bargained for either. We have to find a way to isolate Putinism without isolating Russia. Because in the long run, a Europe that is whole, free, and at peace The dream of those great patriots in 1945 and 1946, when things seemed so bleak, that Europe will be safer, more secure, and more complete if there are no longer boundaries between East and West. That is the dream that we must keep in mind as the transatlantic relationship enters a new phase. Thank you very much.